I'm Robert Manne, and I'm talking today with Professor Simon Marginson on the whole question of universities and higher education. Simon, I'd partly like to thank you for the contribution to the book, which is, I think, a marvellous overview in a very short amount of words, a real achievement. You begin somewhere, and I'd like to begin where you begin because it's the most general question. It always used to amuse me that Robert Menzies was praised for his university building at a time when every government in the Western world was doing what he did. And you say, and I think it's just obviously true, that there is a massive shift in all industrial or post-industrial societies towards very large emphasis on higher education or universities or whatever you want to call them.
Yes.
And I assume that the basic reason is that at a certain point, contemporary economies require large numbers of highly trained symbolic analysts and highly trained professionals and paraprofessionals. Is that your general sense, that this revolution is something that no Western society or modern society can bypass?
I think that's the case, and there's two elements to that. I mean, one is that there seems to be a consensus about innovation in not only in terms of new products and processes, but more generally in terms of work organisation and social culture, as being an endemic feature of contemporary economies, which are increasingly being called knowledge economies. And that innovation in turn requires a capacity in basic research. And basic research of the classical curiosity-driven kind, as well as applied and commercial research. And that is the most common element across the world at the moment. I mean, Australia hasn't really caught on to this, but most of the OECD and China and Singapore and Taiwan and Korea in Asia are investing heavily in basic research again, as they did really in the 60s and 70s. The other element to it, which is the one you've referred to, which I think is a little bit decoupled from the innovation argument, is a shift in the character of mass work, of the larger sort of industrial profile of work. And there the shift towards services and towards a more sophisticated use of literacy and culture in a lot of products, and that's certainly the case in industries like tourism, for example, becoming central, and that in turn, and this is where the argument's been more contentious, calling up a need for larger quantities of graduates.
Yes.
I think the jury's out on to what extent the knowledge economy is about a revolution in production in general and about a transformation of work in general. It's clearly important in a range of areas, especially those that are IT sensitive. Whether it's changed the nature of industrial work remains to be seen, I think.
But anyhow, the general point is that you say that for the first time in history, when we've got to the 21st century, it's not nations or even empires that are determining matters, but somehow things that are happening on a global basis.
I think so. And these things do tend to go in sort of global waves, even before the sort of present very globally intense communicative sort of period that we're in now. You had, as you referred to before, the process of nation-building universities and the first glimmers of mass education and a larger research function in the 50s, 60s, 70s throughout the developed world, and Australia was eventually part of that. And again, as you say, now we're seeing a sort of common process. And I don't think any government ultimately is going to step aside from that. You simply look bad on the international comparative charts, which seem to be becoming increasingly important for governments.
And there is the next move you make, and it's one, I must say, having the information put together very briefly about what happened to the higher educational university sector during the Howard years is rather bracing. To some extent shocking. Could just for the sake of those who are watching this, could you give a kind of a quick picture of the major sort of developments or lack of development in higher education during the Howard period?
I think the Howard government stepped aside from the emerging consensus around the knowledge economy about investing in basic research and increasing the number of tertiary graduates and so on. It stepped aside from that. It saw the universities as a sort of political problem, a problem of managing opinion and managing a potentially anti-government constituency.
Where elites lived.
And there was the talk about elites, and of course intellectual elites potentially were a challenge to the government on a number of different policy points, like the Republic, like the Indigenous agenda, I mean, like refugee policy, I mean, a lot of the big issues of values, how it did face potential opponents inside the universities. But that he allowed that to colour his thinking, I think, to a counterproductive degree, even from the point of view of a Conservative government, because in the end the universities got so savaged in terms of funding that Australia was a standout in the OECD region. I mean, we were the only nation that reduced public funding of universities in the period that Howard was in office between 1995 and 2005. Oh yes, well it was a 4% cut in the absolute level of funding, but when you look at it per student basis, I mean there was growth in student numbers during the period, so the actual cut in per student terms was 28%.
Yes.
And this was extraordinary, really.
Yeah, when I saw that in the chapter, I hadn't quite taken in how large a cut they had.
And these are totally non-controversial figures. I mean, they're standardised to the nth degree. The OECD negotiates with all the national governments. It gets a sign-off on the figures. So this is the Australian government's own figures, if you like, verified at an international level.
And I mean, another figure that, just in this area, that came as a bit of a shock to me when I saw it, was participation rates. Yes. I hadn't realised how much they'd shifted over that period. Roughly, what was the shift in?
Well, there's a lot of talking down and of participation in tertiary education, and there was the argument, which had a sort of grain of truth in it, but I think was problematic in the way it was used, that students should aspire perhaps to TAFE rather than to university, sort of downshifting of expectations, if you like, which would have been good if TAFE had been built as a stronger vocational sector and there'd been an industry alignment with an increased number of graduates coming out and so on. But in fact, TAFE was underfunded and worse funded than the universities in the Howard years. Yes. So it was really quite a cheap trick to say, don't worry too much about tertiary education.
Yes.
And which was, as I said, a standout policy. I mean, no other government was really saying this.
Yes.
Even the governments on the neocon side of politics weren't saying that.
That's right.
And what happened to participation was that increasingly students at the end of school started going straight into the workforce. And instead of approximately 4 in 10 going straight from school to first year university the next year, it fell to 3 in 10. And that wouldn't have been a problem if some of those who were, the 1 in 10 who used to go to university and had stopped going straight to university were going to go at a later stage, but there's no evidence that they were doing that. And some of them are clearly being lost to education.
But then if we break down the figures just a little bit more, because I do think the figures are really interesting, Australia's, as I understand it from reading the chapter, close to the top of OECD in terms of private expenditure in tertiary or higher education.
That's true,
and close to the bottom in terms of public expenditure.
Yes.
And I see this, I've worked at the university for a long time, as you have. I've watched what's happened. And in terms of the private input of money, which has changed considerably over the last decade or more, something that in a way is good, but in a way is not so promising, is the international student load, which you talk about with great interest. And I'd like you to say something about that. One thing is that what kind of international students is Australian higher education getting and aspiring to?
I think what happened was that when the Howard government reduced the rate of funding of public places, the universities no longer had an incentive to talk up participation. There was very little community pressure to expand the number of government-funded places. But the level of funding applied to those places had become so low that the universities were losing money on the provision of each of those domestic student places, which is their core business, arguably. So to fill that gap that this had created, they had to recruit more and more international students. And such was the driver at work here that the number of international students jumped to 3.5 times what it was in 1995 by the year 2005.
3.5 times.
Which is an astonishing growth. So it reached 250,000 in 2005. So you had a situation where 25%, 1 in 4 of all students in universities were international students. Now, there's some positive sides to that in the sense that there's a tremendous level of engagement particularly with China and India and Southeast Asia, which is where most of the students come from. And if that was played out in a richer intercultural experience, it would be still better. But I suspect largely it hasn't been because universities have been too strapped for cash to really expand their teaching approach.
It's only, I mean, if I go by my own university, it's only certain kinds of courses.
Yes.
I mean, I teach in the humanities and
Yes.
social sciences, and it's virtually unaffected at an undergraduate and even a postgraduate level by international students. There's a little bit, but very little.
It's marginal. Yes.
It's very marginal. Whereas in IT or in certain business courses and so on, it's had an enormous impact. Engineering, I think, and so on. Is that roughly what's happened?
That's exactly right. So because this process has been driven by market forces, and it's been so driven in the sense that the universities have been really enrolling any and every international student they can get.
Yes.
There's been no real sense of balanced planning about it, either from the government side or from the university side. So we've had this phenomenal growth in business and to a lesser extent in computing. I mean, computing was the fastest growing area until the computer labour market, the IT labour market for graduates began to fall apart.
Yeah.
It's no longer a lucrative income earning area. You've got to struggle along with the arts and humanities and social science graduates now.
Yes.
But businesses continue to just grow and grow and grow because a business degree is broadly tradable in both the public and private sectors. And that's true offshore as well as onshore. So that's become the location of growth. The other thing is that we're taking in students in great numbers from certain countries but not from other countries. So we're getting a lot of students coming in from India who are taking advantage of the immigration system, which allows international student graduates some points advantage.
So it's a sort of potential migration.
It's migration driven rather than education driven.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of students coming in from China, some of whom seek to migrate, many of whom go back, but they're seeking out Australia because it's become a more attractive destination for them than the US and UK. US because it's a more, I guess, touchy environment to enter. For a student from a non-white background and from East Asia. And the UK is a bit more expensive than Australia, and Australia's closer and a little bit easier to live in.
Yes.
There are perhaps a few more opportunities for work here too. So we've got a lot of students from China, a lot of students from India, but we haven't got a lot of students from outside the Asia-Pacific region. I mean, we don't get many students from Europe or very few Spanish speakers from Latin America and very few from Africa.
And one of the things that's also interesting is that very few doctoral students.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, you assume when you talk postgraduate and, a very large number of postgraduate students, I used to think that's great because doctoral studies is the high point of any university study. Yeah. But there's the figures again, the US has, I think, 1/5 of its international students doing doctorates. We have, 3 or 4%?
Well, the irony is, we think of America as the home of markets and the home of the higher education market because that's how our colleagues in the US talk about higher education so much. But in fact, America is a very policy-shaped environment in the university sector, as in many other sectors. And you see that the international education there is not a product of an effort to create revenue so much as, or to cut government funding by substituting international student fees in place of it. It's seen as an arm of foreign policy, basically.
Yes.
And the US is focused on getting the best and the brightest from around the world and to bringing those bright students into its knowledge economy and keeping them in the US as migrants, with something like half of all doctoral graduates in the US staying on.
Yes.
And of course, the flow of doctoral students into the US is greatly encouraged by what is a generous array of scholarships. So you have a situation where there's something like 100,000 doctoral students in American universities from other countries each year. And roughly 60% of those, 60,000, are supported by scholarships.
Yes.
Now here, we don't bother with this kind of knowledge economy, best and brightest agenda. We're only concerned about making money out of them. So we don't want to give them scholarships because that costs us money. Yes. We want to charge them full fees. As a result, we don't get the best students because they go where the scholarships are. And they go to the UK as well as the US because the UK also offers scholarships.
Now, just one more thing in this sort of, I think, fascinating diagnosis of the kind of overall situation during the last government, higher education. And that is, roughly speaking, the private expenditure and the public expenditure kind of level out. And so even though we've fallen behind because everyone else seems to be spending more, we're roughly where we were 12 years ago. But again, something that I've noticed and I think is very true, and I'd like you to say something about it, is that quite a lot of that expenditure is going in new areas. Two in particular that pain me. One is marketing, where there's a growth of the attempt of universities to sell themselves internationally and locally and to compete with each other in a way that I think you think is rather just wasteful of resources.
I think so, yeah. It doesn't add up to any value in terms of better teaching or better research or better community service. You could put it down to communication. So I suppose at its best it is supplying information, but marketing is not usually all the information you need when you're trying to make decisions about what university to go to. We think about $100 million is spent just on international marketing, at least that figure. It may be actually considerably higher than that, but that was the figure that was collected in an audit of Australian universities. Now, in addition to that, they spend money on domestic marketing as well. I mean, it goes a little further than that, because what you might call the cost of competition, when it's configured in this particular way, as a sort of competition game between institutions, involves also provision of new facilities often. I mean, a lot of money seems to end up in new buildings that you'd rather see in the classroom or in the research lab again. A good example, for example, is University of South Australia, which made about $110 million on the offshore market, that is transnational education, providing education in Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong in the late 1990s. So $110 million is a lot of money. Now, they could have used that to create a whole set of research activities and build themselves up as a research university, which they wanted to be. But their first port of call was facilities and buildings, and they ended up spending all of that money on a major new precinct in the centre of Adelaide, and sort of establishing a stronger competitive position vis-a-vis the University of Adelaide and Flinders, but without adding to the teaching and research effort at all. So you look at that amount of money and you say, well, it's such a waste. But that enhanced their competitive position as they saw it. I mean, they could recruit more international students, they could get more local students.
Yes. Now, let's turn to the present and future. You say about Rudd, government, that you are cautiously optimistic. So I want to, in a way, ask you about both the adjective and the noun.
Yes.
But I'll start with the noun. Why optimistic, and then later, why cautious?
I think that a lot of us have been gradually learning about this ministry and this Prime Minister, and there's much learning yet to be done. But my impression, for what it's worth, and this is where we are in the realm of judgment and even hunch, is that Rudd is serious about a number of things that are central to this education and research building agenda. One is that he's serious about expertise and its role in public life and public policy, and including, to the level of business strategy. I mean, he thinks that judgment, expert judgment, is important. That goes to questions about the social sciences and the sciences, and that intellectuals as a group, if they're practical, useful people, are, and of course the definition of practical and useful is always open to debate, are people that potentially are an important part of the national effort.
And his life, in a way.
And that's how, and he epitomises this. I mean, he's got a history of working hard and using expertise. He operates at the top end intellectually of policy making. He doesn't play that game which so many politicians, but not all politicians, play, of dumbing debate down, of using caricature and slogan, of creating category divisions which suit his purposes. He tends not to operate in that way. And while no doubt, winning office is very important to him, and he's already preparing for the next election, otherwise he wouldn't be there, he does seem to want to operate, I guess, in a more complex way than his predecessor. So and that bears well in terms of intellectual values and for the value which he will put on others who have intellectual values and commitments. So that's a good sign. The second one is that...
That's part of the optimism.
Yes, that's part of the optimism. I guess the second one is that the government itself seems to have started well in terms of it hasn't jumped in with slogans and populism. It's generally started a process of building expertise in different portfolio areas, including this one. I mean, there's been no haste to come up with policies. I thought the only ill-advised policy in education was the computing in schools one, which arguably is gimmicky and isn't going to work terribly well. And I think it was probably more about sort of a statement about networking everyone into the digital economy than it was about education, and perhaps there's not terribly good use of resources. But apart from that, there's been a caution and also a recruitment of people like Glenn Davis and like Barry McGaw who's looking at the reform of of school curricula around Australia who really are very good, in their field. I mean, Barry's probably the best in the world in some respects in that area. It was very
You better
wise.
explain to people who he is.
Barry McGaw was the director of the Australian Council for Educational Research in Melbourne for quite a while, but he then went to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, which arguably is the premier sort of policy job, I suppose, and he became their education head. So he knows education around the world.
And what's he doing with
very,
the Rudd
very well.
government?
He's chairing a review and really leading a review of school curricula, which will look at how the different states prepare students in both the basic areas, like literacy, and the larger sort of sciences and humanities and so on at the end of school. And we'll attempt to align them more effectively with each other. We'll look at curriculum structure. We'll look at the movement of students between states and how well that's facilitated by the current arrangements and so on, and may develop something towards a national curriculum. I mean, it's not terribly clear how far they'll go down that road, but clearly they're going to standardise in a useful way. Barry will do that well. He was a good appointment and it's a good sign. I suppose the caution comes from the recognition of two things. I mean, one is the political process itself is always fraught, that expectations tend to be disappointed. If we build ourselves up too much, we're just building ourselves up for a fall. So one is always cautious for that reason. But more to the point, perhaps, in this area, I don't think the argument has been won about the knowledge economy, about education and research being more central than they used to be, and about it being necessary now to treat the universities as an investment and not a cost. I think that there's substantial resistance to that shift in Treasury, which is the key department in this area as in so many others, while there is clearly some sympathy for endogenous growth theory, which is the sort of economic building blocks of the knowledge economy argument. That's by no means unanimously held in Treasury. So
that's interesting.
I'd say that...
Is there argument in Treasury, you think? But...
Oh, yes, I think there's debate within Treasury on this, and I think that you're going to see a situation where the PM is convinced of it, and PM's department may well be negotiating with Treasury over time about how to handle the knowledge economy. And we saw that happen prior to the Dawkins reforms, which were a mixed blessing, of course, in the 1980s. It was the Prime Minister's department that stepped in and came up with a series of proposals for modernising and changing the higher education system. And it was subsequent to that those proposals were pushed through. So it was PMs that played the leading role. It seems to be often more strategic in these areas than Treasury is. Treasury is more of a blocker, and Treasury's instinct is to say, let's keep out of this, let's just leave it to the institutions, leave it to the market, devolve the responsibility away from government. I think Rudd will want to do more than that, but he'll have to convince Treasury to spend money to back up his vision.
And I take it your other caution is, and in a way, even since you've written the chapter, it's probably grown, which is the fiscal caution, the worry about...
That's right. I mean, there's not many options for the government initially. They've locked themselves into the tax cuts package. Clearly, the macroeconomy is not moving in their favour at the moment. They're not going to have surplus revenues of the kind that blessed the Howard government and its political manoeuvring in the last period. So I would expect a second-term Rudd government will have more fiscal options than a first, because the first one is committed to 3 years of tax cuts on the Howard/Rudd plan.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where one of the things that worried me when I read the chapter, and I was thinking about it before this conversation. There are quite a lot of things that you recommend, which would cost quite a lot of money.
Some of them do, yes.
I mean, if you at least stop HECS rising, in that there's money. If you build up, as I think is a great idea, a new core of middle career academics with fellowships, something that I think Rudd has promised, but which again would cost quite a bit of money.
Yes.
There are many things of that kind which you recommend, and there's also, they're going to, and you sort of half warn about this, they're going to prevent domestic full fee paying.
They have said that.
They've said that, and it'd be astonishing if they change that. Yes. So I can see a lot of things are going to be in a very tight fiscal situation. A lot of things that need to be done, even to get, say, staff-student ratios more reasonable, are going to cost quite a lot of money.
Yes. I think it divides into things which are doable and things which are harder.
Yeah. What I was going to ask you is what is most important? If you had to talk to Mr. Rudd and advise, given that there's not a lot of extra money around, what are the kinds of expenditures or cuts in growth of expenditure like HECS? Which are the things you think are most important to improve in the short term the university sector?
I would say the biggest single problem, and any progress on this problem is going to help us, is the rundown of basic research. I mean, that's been going on over really 15 years. Yeah. It derives from the fact that the level of funding for what we call basic teaching and research student places, that is the student places that are supported by teaching and research academic labour, yeah. Which always has partly supported research time as well as teaching time. The rundown of the value of those places the first casualty has been research time, and increasingly research time has been centred on a smaller number of people who've got specific project funding, which is always quite a small minority. So our research capacity has been run down, and those who have project funding, the high flyers, if you like, are under tremendous work pressures, as everyone knows, within the university. So research is really the area where Australia, I think, long-term stands to suffer most from the neglect, probably not only of the Howard years, but a little before that as well. So we need to put every possible dollar into research, and putting dollars into mid-career fellowships is a good idea, because that is one way you can build capacity for the medium
really
term.
Supporting them properly.
Yeah, without a huge expenditure. I mean, to put proper funding into several of the major universities to bring them up to, say, the ANU level would cost probably 200 or 300 million each a year, and that's you're looking billion plus there. Yes. But to do the mid-career fellowships thing, we're looking at lower levels, 150, 200 million. You could do a lot of that. Yes. And also you could put serious money into doctoral scholarships for foreign students and start to pick up the best students from China and India as well as the others. Yeah. And so you could do a certain amount with research, I think, without spending a huge amount of money, but ultimately it is going to require serious money. So research is probably the biggest single thing, although it's not the most popular or most sexy thing.
And do you think it's more, I mean, something else you point out, and parents know this, I'm sure, that, students now work 15 or 20 hours a week normally when they're doing their degrees, but also those from the country or those from poorer families are really finding it tough, and it may be related to participation as well. How do you rank the sort of the priority of research, and which you've been talking about, against, let's say, the more democratic or egalitarian impulse, which is to make it more possible for those without resources to go to university, but also to not go to university and to be scrambling to earn enough to keep themselves there?
Well, I think you're right. You've identified the next thing I was going to mention, which is precisely that area of funding student participation properly and creating greater equality of access. At the moment, with something like 70% of our students working, many of them working more than 20 hours a week, and a large minority saying it's interfering with their studies. Yes. We have a real problem of disengagement forced by a lack of student financial support of the kind that we used to have in Australia. I mean, when I went through university in the 70s, something like 2/3 to 70% of all students were receiving either Commonwealth living allowance through Tertiary Education Assistance Scheme, the old Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme as it was, or they were receiving teaching scholarships. Yes. Now, the teaching scholarships disappeared, although they might have to come back one of these days because we need teachers and we need good students to become teachers. But as it stands now, it's so hard to get Commonwealth assistance that the percentage of people receiving that's shrunk to 27%. That's 1 in 4.
27%.
So total number of students receiving assistance has dropped from about 70% to about 27%. So we have a big falling away in support provided to allow students to study while they're enrolled. And that must be affecting socioeconomic equality, because people from poorer backgrounds need those kinds of supports more than anyone else does. The cost of inner city rents. I mean, someone going from Gippsland, from relatively low income, modest family income in Gippsland, moving to Melbourne, having to pay inner city rents, having to work often 30, 40 hours. I mean, the option of going to the workforce then becomes much more attractive, even though ultimately you don't have the same kind of workforce options if you don't have a tertiary degree. So it's all related. Talking down on participation and the lack of student financial support are all part of a process which has led to a withdrawal from education. So that's clearly the next one we have to crack. Yes. But the problem with the student allowances issue is that it's so expensive to fix. Things have run down so far that we're looking at billions of dollars to get a proper student support scheme back. So we're going to have to do it by degrees, I think. Yeah. But clearly we need to move in that direction.
So it really is that's a long term.
Yes. Problem. Otherwise we're always going to have this problem of not enough students and not enough good, bright, poorer students going to university.
Yeah, well, it shows you what happened during the Howard
I think
period
so,
that it's
yes.
going to be very hard for the Rudd government to get on top of that.
Especially if it preserves all the pork barrelling and other handouts that came forward in the Howard period.
Well, I hope we don't have an election like we've been having in the last few, where so much money is thrown around. I wish we could get over that.